So as you can see here, I've done some cleanup and I've merged all of those shapes and I stitched them all together into one. And what I also did, I filled the space behind them. So this is in fact one continuous piece and not made out of floaters. And there is still some endgones and stuff that needs to be cleaned up, but this is something I'm gonna worry about later. And I think one of the cool things is when you look at the reference, sometimes those things, they could be floaters. But looking at the reference here, you can see that, for example, this is one piece of wood. However, this is one piece of, basically this is made from one single piece of wood. So it would help if we have edge loops, such as this, that we could use to cut those pieces from each other in the UVs and then give them the same texture. And whenever you have something like this, you can see that, for example, the fibers are not following the curvature of the shape, which is kind of cool, and we could use just a triplanar on that. So hypothetically speaking, it could have been a floater. But all the accumulation of the dirt and the glue and the gradual transition here, this is something that is best achieved with the bevel. So this is why I chose for the entire thing to be one single mesh. And what remains for me to do is just to finish cleaning up those pieces at the top. And one thing to keep in mind is whenever you create those in the first place, it really helps if you have at least some of the edges to match. So for example, you see this edge is matches this edge on all of the meshes, and you can see that this mesh here has edges that clearly divide it into 4 parts, and because I have 4 of those different shapes here. And for example, this shape, because it has 3 shapes, I made it in a way that each of those radial subdivisions is actually divisible by 3. And what I'm doing next is just creasing those edges that I intend to bevel. Because we're going to be looking at this door probably from at least this distance, I'm thinking that potentially it's not the best idea to add the very fine details, such as, for example, all those shapes here, just because from this distance this reads like a noise and doesn't read well. And also to keep this workshop manageable and to save some time, I'm just gonna reuse some of the shapes at the top, and I'll not add some of the final detail. However, I will be beveling it and still making it look good and read nicely from a distance. So I will keep cleaning this up and I will show you the progress. So after a lot of cleanup and UVs, you can see here the result. As you can see, everything here is one continuous mesh, which has been split into different UV islands by the corresponding pieces of the wood in the reference. So for example, this would be one piece, and this would be a different piece, and this would be one different piece as well. And the trick to have nice wooden stuff is to make sure that the UV is laid out in a way that the fibers on the wood follow it consistently. And for example, if you have a frame, just make sure that the fibers are following each side of the frame instead of just having them set in one direction. And this is what makes a texturing process a bit simpler in Substance Painter, just having the UV islands of wood to be laid out horizontally in a way that the moment I overlay them with a tileable, they're just gonna work off the bat. And whenever I have stonework or glass or potentially metal, I try to align the UV islands in a way that's consistent with their orientation in the real world, meaning that this piece that if it stands vertical, I wouldn't align it horizontally, such as wood, because then I would not get consistent droplets and other directional stuff that is affected by real world. And now that I have done this, and I still have all the different backups of all the different stages of the modeling of the wooden pieces, I can always use those to create the side windows, and so I'm gonna do. So I will just go ahead, model those windows using those pieces, and I will skip ahead and I'll show you the next step. So I've done the windows, as you can see here, and I've positioned the door. It still misses a few parts in the door frame, and this is why I want to jump ahead to the windows, because this is going to be the same approach I'm going to use in this area. So whenever we look at windows, we see something like this, and there is quite a few ways to tackle it. And for example, you could model this entire unit as one piece, because you can see the paint here really blended all the parts together and covered all the different gaps between the different parts. Or you could separate it into glass and this inner frame and this outer frame, because those two different parts, and this bottom part slides up. And there is also this overall window frame, and there is also even this sort of transition in between the wooden frame and the stonework. So we could model it as one unit, and we could have the glass as one unit, which would then allow us to paint the paint and have this gradual transition onto the glass. But in this case, I'll just model it with separate parts. Looking at the reference, our windows are a bit simple, and they are not made out of two different parts that slide up and down, but I suspect that this part either pivots or tilts in one way or another, because you can see there is still a separate frame, and there is a gap here, which means that this window is able to be opened. But you can see there is still this sort of glue or putty or cement or whatever this is that connects and blends between the stonework and the wooden parts. And another thing that we need to pay attention to on this reference is that this here is not a straight angle. You can see it slightly tapers and widens towards the glass. So what I've done so far is I took this part of the stonework, I selected those faces, just like with the door, I duplicated them, and then I've created this piece. And notice how I already have the edges in position where I want the joints of the wood to be. And now what I need to do is I need to create a glass pane. So I created one here. Whenever we create glass, we need to pay attention to the thickness of it, because if we make it too thick, it's going to look like it's some bulletproof glass and it's going to look weird. So what I did, I created something which is 5 millimeter thick. You see it's half of 1 centimeter. And what I will do now is I will just create an edge loop on those two parts. I will then bevel it, and I could try and eyeball the bevel, or instead I could just scale this. Need to make sure that I'm not in component but in world space, and scale this part to the glass width as well. And now we can also try and grab both of them and extrude them or translate them in some way or another. Something here is wrong, so it doesn't let me select it. So we could give it a nice push out, or we could just extrude it a bit so we know the exact thickness, so we could use the translate tool and just transform face and give it a nice 0.2, 0.5 maybe. And we could then start shaping it a bit more. And in order to create the frame, what I will do, I will just add an edge loop, or maybe a couple of edge loops. So let's say a couple of edge loops, 2 and 2 here. And then I can just select maybe fuel, those faces, duplicate them, delete this part, delete this, and normally I would just work on one window, but because I have the upper and the bottom part which are not identical, and the upper part has this annoying part here which would be very tricky to replicate, so what I would do, I would just either work on two of them at the same time, or I would work on this part because I can then always make it 90 degrees here by just cutting the upper part and creating this 45-degree cut with the knife tool like I've shown before. But in case I'm working on one of them or two of them, it doesn't matter. What I would do, I would just use the same workflow. I would start adding edge loops, and I would just keep extruding both of them until I create what I need it to be. So for example, something like this. I would use thickness, of course, and again, like I'm extruding more polygons than I need to. If you look at the back face, you can see this shouldn't be selected, but it gives you the idea of how I would approach it. And after having done that, I would just make sure that indeed this inner part is protruding out a bit. And then you can always just grab those faces as well, and then just duplicate it and create a bridge. I think something here is broken, or the normals are not what they should be. So lighting, interesting. So I think the bottom part needs to have the normal flipped. This is better. Okay. Maybe a bit thicker. Something like this, and again depending on the reference, and then I would just duplicate the middle part and I would solve all the intersections. So that's how I would approach the windows, and of course there is always some sort of window sill at the bottom, something like this, so don't forget to add that part as well. And whenever I have this window shape, and I'm not sure how many of those horizontal lines I have, or maybe I have a few of them and I don't know like what the exact distance between them could be. So the way to approach this is I will just snap one here, and then I would snap one at the top. And then let's say I want 4 of them, so 1, 2, Shift D to duplicate it again, and now you see there is 4 different sections here, or maybe I want one more, so there is 5 sections, and you see instead of trying to add edge loops and trying to eyeball it, what I can do, I can just select all of them and center pivot, don't freeze transformation, And then I could go to modify snap align objects and align objects options. And if I have it set, by default, editor settings, it's set to world X and mid. So if I hit apply, nothing is gonna happen. So what I will do, I'll just set it to world Y and distance and pay attention to the distance between them. It's just gonna space them between all the extremes, so between this one and this one. So for example, I don't know, if I have something like this, it will just evenly space out between them, which is very nice, and it helps us a lot in this particular case. So for example, if I were to add now the vertical line, and I will just stretch it, and let's say I don't like that those shapes are rectangular and I want them to be a bit more square. So bear in mind I do need the one at the top and the one at the bottom for this case, because otherwise it's just not gonna work. So this is the top one, the bottom one, sorry, and this is the top one. And I'll grab those, and maybe I'll put this for the moment in layer so I don't need to select it every time I grab it. So let's say maybe I want one more and I'm not sure, so let's do it, apply, maybe one more, apply, and this gives me a bit more rectangular shape that I'm happy now with. So this is just one trick to space out objects, and it's very useful and also useful when you do something like this. But you just need to make sure that you duplicate something for me to start and something for me to end to match the outer frame. Now, looking at this, I have the window sill, I have the frame, I have all those horizontal and vertical divisions. And one thing that really stands out as CG is this very straight line here, and also very lots of straight lines. So sometime along the process, when I'm done with the bevels and everything else, I will just add a couple of edge loops and I will just shift things ever so slightly left and right, and sometimes it's better to just offset those towards the edges, just so in case you need to remove this, you can always just delete and it's gonna snap back into a straight line. To edge loop and delete. Or maybe you could just offset it wherever you need it. But I would break up those edges a bit. And regarding this edge, if you remember, I was mentioning about modeling this sort of material here in transition. So what I will do, I will just grab either the frame or the stonework, it doesn't matter, let's grab the stonework, and I will duplicate the faces again. And I would grab this part, I would bring it closer, and I would push it a bit in. Notice that you have self-intersections that you will have to resolve. And I will take this part and I will push it a bit out. Give it an edge loop in the middle, and then push this one out again. And again, this is something that needs to be resolved, but you can see now I have a nice shape in here that kind of fills the gap. Maybe push this one out a bit more, or just backwards. I will just take care of this by doing this. And again, this is the one part that you can be a bit sloppy about it, because you actually want it to be broken up. Otherwise, you would have to add all those edge loops in the model of the window frame or add it in displacement, and this is not something that you might want. So I'll just tuck this behind this and tuck this behind that. And let's say if we do have the window sill, probably it would be a bit higher and this thing would go underneath it. Something like this. And what I will do now, I will just add a few edge loops. So let's say 4 here. And then let's say 30 here. Maybe 3 here. And maybe a dozen at the bottom. And now that I have this, I can select the vertices. I can hit transform, and in transform you see I have a random, so I'll set it to 6 or even 10, and I'll translate 0.01, 0.1 maybe, okay, 0.05. And let's look at what it gives us. If I smooth the edge, you can see now I have this sort of broken up line and this sort of like broken up material here in between. And I could go ahead and maybe I could just select some random areas with some soft selection and push them out completely. Just so you see there is now a gap where the material is worn out, and imagine that once we have the final result and the window frame is going to have bevels, something like this. Now you're going to have this sort of nice gap between the window frame and the stonework, and you could always like play around with it and maybe scale down some of those just so the distance between the different shapes is not as uniform as it is now. So there's lots of ways you could tweak it. But in general, I feel that from this distance or even this distance, this gives you a bit nicer result than just having a straight line. And it solves you also the problem of having to add all those edge loops in here and breaking it up manually. And you can always just, you know, if we want more material, we can always just push it out a bit and just make sure that the inner edge is tucked behind, or we could always just, with holding control and being in move mode, we could always just push it out and have it a bit thin, and then you can always like have those intersections that create those gaps in the material, which might be something you want. And yeah, this is it regarding the wooden parts. With the window now done and UV'd, I can now duplicate it around and match the rest of the other shapes. And before we do that, one thing I want you to pay attention to is if we don't optimize the UVs before duplicating, faces such as this and those ones that are intersecting with the walls, and even if the window is open, we would never see them because they are just stationary. Notice how much space they are taking in the UV space. They can take up to a half or about 1/3, depending on your model. And what I want to do before I go ahead and duplicate this, I just want to take the faces that we don't see, and I will just scale them down a bit and optimize my model. Something like this. And yeah, it will cause some stretching in those areas, but again, we will never be able to see them. And even if this window, let's say, was pivoting and was rotating, those faces, I would keep them as they are. However, the ones at the back, I would highly recommend scaling them down because whenever you have a final model, you might want to slightly tweak it, maybe have some of the windows slightly open, have some gaps that are different between the different frames. But again, those faces, you could scale them down, or you could even delete them. I personally tend to keep them just because I don't want any light coming through the windows and the frames and cause some artifacts. But again, up to you, and if you want to optimize it a bit more, you can even delete those faces altogether. With this out of the way, I want to talk about glass. Now, I could use individual panels such as this for each section. I could also create one big glass panel like so, and then just divide it into ratio. The way I do this, I tend to create individual panels for larger sections, such as this, and whenever I have a window like this with smaller individual panels, I tend to do those in ratio, and this whole section would be just one part of glass, one plane of glass. And I would do this in here, for example. I would duplicate the section of the window, and again, I would add some levels to it probably before I do that. And I will just scale this one section all the way like this. Maybe have it even intersect with the wall a bit, just so no light is leaking in between. And maybe a bit to the bottom, and then all the smaller details we're gonna have, such as those shapes. I will try and achieve them with just the texture. Now, the way I would approach all these intricate models is I would tackle it from two different directions. So for example, I would start by creating a cube and seeing the width of this LED stripe, how much it needs to be. And I will just duplicate those diagonal lines here and in the other direction, and then I would just combine them into one model just so I can have this continuous nice blobs of metal that are welding them together. And then I would take the stonework frame, I would separate the faces from it, and I would push them in so they form those shapes that are complementing them and go around them. And then I would extrude it, and I would give it the same thickness as the size of these cubes, just to make sure that all the LED stripes have a consistent thickness. And then I would probably just try and combine them into one mesh using the techniques I've shown you before. Looking at this window here, I was able to just create a cube such as this, and after rotating it and scaling it to match the reference, I was able to tell that 1 centimeter is going to be perfect for what we need. So we have one section here, so I will just move it right over here, and I will duplicate, move it up, Shift D, and I'll keep hitting Shift D until I got all of them duplicated. So I'll just offset them a bit more towards where they should be. And if you need to duplicate more of them and you forgot, it's not a big deal. You just snap it into one of the edges and just so it duplicates, and snap it again, and then snap it onto the next edge, because now we have two meshes here that are positioned in the same place. So I'm snapping it into the next one and offsetting it again, and here we go. That forms this shape, and it follows the reference nicely. I can just combine those together and delete the ones I do not need. And I can now also duplicate and flip them in the other direction and do this. And then whenever I clean this up, I'll just need to do one section. instead of all of them, so I can just do something like cutting those faces with those ones, something like this, something like this as well. And I know that this is going to be the middle, so now I can just use this one over here to duplicate it here, and just like so I can cut them all and combine them and bridge them like I've shown you before. As for the window frame, so I will just grab this section, I will duplicate the polygons, I will isolate it, make sure that they have the same exact thickness as the LED stripes I already have, something like this, and then remember it needs to be pushed inward, and here is where it gets a bit funny when you have bevels. So what I'll do, I'll just get rid of the bevels real quick, because just I'll keep the bevel on this side just so you can see what it does. So let's say I want to push this one in up to here, and then I want to create a second one, so duplicate it, I'll keep pushing it in so they both touch this LED stripe on this left hand side, which then I can just fix. So again, if I did remove those edges in the first place, I wouldn't have had this problem, but not too late to do it now. But if you look here, you can see the bevel did a lot of artifacts, which we don't want. So I'm gonna take a look here, get rid of those edges, those are good. Combine it, and if you remember, the thickness was 1 centimeter, so just give it 1 centimeter. And this now has the same exact thickness as the other LED stripes. And it's just a matter of combining them and finessing and moving those one by one if needs be until they are intersecting, or just selecting those faces and creating a knife tool, which we then could, remember it works in 3D space as well, we could just cut them like this. After showing you this technique, I went ahead and I created the metal parts for the windows. As you can see, they are all continuous pieces, which then will allow me to then select those central polygons and use them as a mask in Substance Painter for the welding in between the different pieces. And also I think it just looks a bit nicer when you look at the geometry as opposed to having separate geometries intersecting with each other. So with that out of the way, and me still working on the windows here and the ornaments on the top of them, what we have to do now is the roof and all the different metal pieces on the top of it, such as those domes. So let's take a look at the reference. Whenever we have some of these copper or bronze or lead sheets at the top, usually what we really need to pay attention to is that we don't give them too much thickness, because those pieces essentially are they have the thickness of a cardboard more or less, because they just cut into pieces and then hammered into shape. So all we have to do is just to make sure we add a couple of edge loops, and then we do some extrusions, and then we round them up to create those rounded shapes, and then we cut the UVs and maybe add a few seams on the model to match the reference. You can see on those images the actual thickness and how thin it is. And you can see all the different scenes and the way it was hammered into shape. One thing to remember is that the metal pieces on the buildings tend to be probably the thinnest and the most fragile pieces, or also the most flexible ones, because they are made from such a thin material. So we need to make sure that we add enough detail in the model and also in the texture, but also we need to make sure that we don't overdo the thickness of the material and the bevels to make it look like it's big and chunky pieces. In addition to those metal domes, what we have on the building is also the different flashing or the coping, and basically those are the stripes of lead or copper, depending on the building, that basically are mass manufactured more or less, and they are added on all the roofs to prevent leaking. And you can see a few things about this. So first of all, it's on the corners of the building, such as this top, and also inside different cavities to prevent water going through the different slates. And you can see that, for example, when we look at skylights, they go in some places underneath the slates, but wherever the water is coming on top of them, they go on top. And you can see, for example, this piece, it starts below and kind of collects the water with it. But towards the bottom, it actually goes on top of the pieces. So whenever you model this, all you have to do is just pay attention in the reference where they start and where they end. And like I said, as a rule of thumb, usually they start below if they're meant to collect water, or if they are on the corners of the roof, they start above the slates. And you can really see how thin and fragile this material and how soft it is, and you can see all the different breakup of the edges, which again, we are not going to be able to do this on an optimized model too much, but again, this is something to keep in mind. And some of it we can fake with displacements and with strategically placed edge loops, but see how broken up this line is. So to summarize, we will start with those pieces at the top, which are essentially just a cylinder, and then a couple of edges coming off of it with some line towards the bottom, and some thinner stripes, possibly from a slightly thicker different metal to hold it in place. So potentially this could be copper, and this is probably iron or steel, and you can see it's rusting, so it's definitely not copper. Then we want to add all of those pieces underneath those roof slates in the different connections between them, and also next to the skylights and around the chimneys. And you can see they go all the way around the chimneys and they go on top of the slates. And you can also see how, because they are hammered into place to create as watertight shape as possible, you can see how they go around each roof slate. Our particular reference doesn't have any downpipes and drains, at least not in visible places here in the reference. So we are not going to be modeling those, but bear in mind that both pipes and all the pieces that I've shown you at the top, they all have different standard dimensions, and so do the slates. So whenever you model something, you might want to Google what's the standard size for those things. I'll start with the rooftops before we proceed to the metal parts, because they're gonna drive a lot of the shape of the metal parts, and they are covering a larger surface area, so might as well do them. So I've got the polyplane here. I've assigned to it a tile door, which is repeated one time, and I scaled this plane up, so each slate is about 25-30 centimeter. Some of them are slightly larger, but on average they are 30 centimeter. And normally when you get a scan from textures.com or Megascans, it will tell you what's the overall scale of the scanned area, so you can use that to actually scale up your plane. And once I've done that, I will open the UV editor and I will sample the texture density. and I will grab the whatever roof I have. At the moment I just created automatic UVs, and as you can see, I've cut them, I will cut them at the top into two parts, so I can then go ahead and make sure that the middle section is always pointing up. And the reason I'm gonna do that is because I want to use this as a trim sheet, and I don't want to create UDIMs for the roof, because otherwise there will be too many UDIMs and it's not gonna really solve any of my problems, which come from the scale of the texture and the repetition in it. So this looks about good, and I will give it the same pixel density that I sampled before, set. So now, I'll get rid of those windows. Now the scale of the slates is correct and is matching whatever I have here. The only problem here is that you can see some of them start a bit higher or lower than the others, and this is not really working well for me. So what I will do, I will just snap them all, the highest point, onto one of those horizontal lines in the UV editor, something like this. And this will also allow me to see how many squares in the UV space they actually take. So this one, I think it needs to be rotated. Yes, it does. So this is the upper point. I will just eyeball it. Good enough. Same with this one. Okay, this is good enough. And now you can see all of them, they start at the same place, and they look nice. And then I could always just grab those, set the same texel density, which is here, and repeat the process on one of them, and then just duplicate it all over to have them match. And maybe offset some of the UVs on the others horizontally, just so there is no repetition on them. For example, you can see this piece, just so it's not visible on each and every one of them. Now, with that out of the way, I have a few issues here. So for example, if I wanted to create a mixed material to address the repetition and create some leaks on the top, it would be a bit challenging without Triplanar, because you can see at the moment the UV space wouldn't be of much of a use to me. So what I could do is I could just try and scale them down until I can see that they fit into the UV space horizontally. And this one, can it be cut into two parts? Yes, it can. So the longer parts, we can cut them in half, because I can always add the chimneys here to mask the seam, and if I'm looking from the courtyard, you can see I will actually never gonna see that. Plus there will be all the metal pieces connecting the chimneys to the roof, so it's really not something I should be concerned with. So I'm just gonna grab those and offset them a bit. This one, can I cut this one? Yes. I could potentially even cut it into 3 parts, but just in case, I'll just cut it in the middle. Something like this. So now that they're a bit more compact horizontally, I can try and scale them down a bit again and see that at the moment they are fitting the UV scale, how many squares they are taking. So at the moment they take about 2.5 squares vertically, and they take 10 squares horizontally, so that's not bad. And we can then calculate the repetition that we need to have on those tileables that we are using. So for example, if I scaled, at the moment this is repeating just once. So if I scaled this to 1/10 of what it is, so instead of 14 it would be 1.4, something like this, then we would have this repeating 10 times. It will still be the same scale. However, now I could take each of those individual UV islands and I could offset them and have a mask done in Substance Painter for the stuff on the roof, all the different leaks and different damage and whatever, and still know the exact number of repetitions I have to have in my tileable in order to make it to scale. I'm gonna undo that. And if I look at my script editor, I will see this line, which I can just copy, paste here, and instead of 1 point whatever, I can just make it 0.2 or whatever is convenient for me. So let's go with 0.2. Let's see how it looks. Okay, this is almost doing what we need, so it almost fits the UDIM with a few exceptions. So offset those aside and see which ones are those. Perfect. Those are the ones that we are actually never gonna see in our context. So I will select those edges, I will cut it, and I will compact them a bit more. I'll just set it over here. And this is now perfectly fitting the UDIM. Now, what I need to do now is, because I scaled it to 0.2, it means that I scaled it 5 times. So I will just go into here, I repeat the UV 5 times, and you can see the scale is back to what it used to be. And the beauty of it is that I can grab the UV islands that we actually see and need. So it's those ones. To UV shell, I'm gonna offset them here, and I can just open my UV settings, adjust in the move steps 0.2. And offset them a bit. Perhaps 0.2 wasn't the best choice because in that case I do not need to cut those anymore. Because basically I want them to have some distance between them horizontally, so I'll just scale them to 0.1. So paste this here, 0.1, 0.1, and let's see what it gives us. Now, granted they are tiny, but what I can do, I can just offset them to 0.2 downwards, and you can see now I have perhaps a slightly larger gap than it needs to be, but you know, you can always recalculate it with maybe half a repetition or whatever. Maybe instead of 5 it could be 6, maybe it could be 5.5. It doesn't matter. For my purpose at the moment, this will do. So I will just take the UV islands that I don't need, and I will offset them over here. And I will make sure that the ones that I do need, they are laid out properly. I can stitch those back together again if I want to. So stitch back. And the ones that we never see, I can just overlay them like this at the bottom, because I don't really care. And this is a bit like the Homer Simpson meme with him looking fit, but behind his back all his skin is collected. And I know that it looks amazing from one angle, but it looks bad from the other. But again, in VFX we do a lot of cheats, and this is not video games, so we need to put the effort where we can, because we don't have unlimited time and resources. So what this allows us to do is, for example, I'll just plug it into ambient color just so we can see a couple of textures at once. I will have this VRAMP, and I will tile it 5 times. And I'm tiling it 5 times because even though we scaled the UVs 10 times, you can see that essentially they take almost 2 squares vertically. So we are talking about 5 repetitions, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And you can see now I have this nice gradient on the roof, which probably should be reversed, because the leaks would come from the top. And something like this. And yeah, of course I would use a proper texture to use it, but for demonstration I think this shows how suddenly there is less repetition, and we don't need to have 20 more UDIMs, because if you look at the surface area of the roof, it's just as big as the surface area of the entire building that we've modeled. So instead of adding another 20 UDIMs to your model and then having gigabytes more textures that are just essentially using the same tiny tileable with the same repetition set to triplanar or whatever, just use a trim sheet, and this is gonna save you a lot of time and resources. And wherever you see lines that you want to get rid of, what you can do is you can just, for example, this line that we cut in the middle, you could always get a lightning rod or some lead strip to run there, or maybe some ropes on the roof, or maybe some sheets of metal to break it up a bit more. So for example, you see there is a repetition here, I could always just add a window here, a skylight, something like this in here, or maybe some other element here, something like this. And suddenly you are not paying as much attention to the repetition anymore. Now, our work on the roof doesn't quite stop here. So what we need to also take into account is all the different gaps and holes made to account for the LED stripes. So for example, in here, the LED strip would run, I will just duplicate this, and I will extrude this way, 2 faces, delete the rest, keep normal. extrude it this way a bit, and again, I would probably create a cube with a scale of, I don't know, 10 centimeter or 15 centimeter, depending on how actually big the LED stripes you're modeling, and make sure that they are correctly scaled. Something like this at the top. And of course the final result should be a bit more accurate than this, but just as a demonstration I would create something like this. Maybe take this edge, extrude it a bit, add a couple of edge loops and inset this a bit. And then, you know, add some thickness, add some bevel, optimize the UVs, create some nice topology and duplicate it a few times. And those things, they tend to be a bit longer, so something like this probably. And again, this is something that you should actually check the scale of it beforehand and model it to scale rather than trying to eyeball it, because those things they have scales. And the good news is the moment you've modeled one, you can just create yourself a set you can reuse for one building in your environment, and the next building you're gonna have to use it. So if you have a large environment with a lot of buildings that share the same elements, such as those metallic parts, you can create yourself a nice set also for future projects. Having checked online on different websites for reclaimed architectural salvage and having the dimensions and comparing them to my reference, I was able to create those metal stripes. And you can see, like I mentioned before, some of them they go on top of the slates in order to seal the shape, and some of them they go underneath. And in the places where they go underneath, the moment we have some breakup, which I achieved by adding those edge loops to the slates, it breaks up the shape a bit. And if that is not going to be enough in the camera, I could always grab those vertices here and I could shift them on a slightly different direction just so it breaks it up a bit more. But I think for the time being this is enough, and again, if it's too straight I can always come back and revisit it. I did put a bit more effort into those attic slates just because we see them a bit more. And if you are wondering what are those red parts of the model, is the parts that I'm going to be reusing the UVs and textures in the model itself. So for example, those two chimneys, there is not really a reason for me to have 4 of them differently textured. I could always just duplicate them and rotate them 180 degrees, and basically that's what I've done. And in this way, considering that the camera is always going to be looking from the courtyard, now I get to see a different side of the same model, and this is gonna save quite a few UDIMs. So I've managed to save a few UDIMs on those chimneys. I've reused some of the metal parts, and again, the rationale here is very simple. Basically, looking through a camera, I'm trying to see which parts of the model we are not going to see close to each other. So for example, if I had those 2 windows from the same, having the same texture, they would look very similar. But for example, if I have this one and this one to be the same window with the same texture, I would probably not notice the difference. So I've done, as you can see, the rest of the model. I've finished the door, I've duplicated it around. I've done the metal parts for the roof, and there's nothing special about them. All I've done is I've created one-sided dome, which I then extruded and added those folds. And what I also did, I've added some sort of thickness, edge loops, and different UV islands to those different parts of the model which correspond to real life. I'll show you the topology. As you can see, nothing too spectacular here. I just split this edge into a couple of them and I solved the angles. So that's about it for the main model at this stage, and I think a lot of it will not need major adjustments, and the ones that will be adjusted are going to be probably coming from needs created by Substance Painter or the render. So for example, if we are looking at the model here and we see that this is awkward, we might want to add another chimney or something else in here, and we maybe want to add something to the walls. And definitely we want to do something with those walls considering how close we're gonna see them. But for the time being, this is good, and we're gonna address the rest of it in the chapters of dressing and how to make the ground and those walls and dress the scene with some extra assets. Now, before we go into texturing, which is gonna be in the next chapter, I just wanted to show what I've done with the UVs so far. So if you remember, the first UDIM was always empty, so what I've done, I went through the newly created models and I offset everything in certain logic. So as you can see, the towers, they kind of occupy the first UDIMs, and the things that are duplicated and they are red, for example, those are the original chimneys. What I've done, I took the UVs and I offset them a bit. More accurately, I moved them 4 times, so 1, 2, 3, 4 up, just so I could always easily select them, because if, for example, they were here, I would really have to zoom in and make sure that I'm not grabbing something else. So I offset them 4 units higher, just so in Substance Painter I don't accidentally have to texture them or bake their textures, because this is gonna make my file heavier and I don't really need that. And once I'm done with the texturing, I can always just grab those UVs over here and offset them back to where they belong. And keep in mind that the file that you're using for a model for presentation and the file that you're using for texturing and your final scene, they don't have to share the exact same model. It's often more convenient to have something that's a bit different, and just as an example, I could use this clock face. So for example, at the moment I have this time set. Now this is fine, however, if I'm gonna use any generator based on ambient occlusion in Substance Painter, it's gonna bake some sort of shadow from those clock arms onto the clock face, which is not something that would exist in real life. So if I'm texturing the clock, I will just probably grab each individual arm and offset them like this, just so they don't have any ambient occlusion baked on each other. Or maybe I would offset them together so they do have some ambient occlusion together, but definitely I wouldn't want to cast any of that onto the clock face. So keep those small details in mind, things that are moving around and you don't want them to be baked in, just offset them for the texturing file. And like I mentioned with the chimneys, everything that I duplicated that reuses the same UVs as the other part of the model, I offset the UVs higher, and once I'm done with the texturing, I'm gonna offset it back. So the whole building, for the time being, is only gonna be using around 30 UDIMs, which is a lot, but keeping in mind that I've seen props that take a few pixels on the screen that they have over 10 UDIMs, I would say this is not an overkill, especially considering that this is gonna be flexible enough to allow us some close camera angles. And still, if you look at this, I'll show you a bit of the logic. So the first 30 UDIMs are what we are using. This one is going to be the roof that is going to be trim sheets and tileables. Those are the two walls that are close to us that we still need to address them a bit. And everything else, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 UDIMs are essentially the ones that are going to be offset back down and reused. So we're already saving here 1/4 of the textures just by smartly reusing some of the assets. And the stuff we have here at the top is, for example, we have some different cubes that I added as an interior, just so whenever we have those windows to be transparent, there's something behind them. And the same goes here. Basically what I've done, I've just done a simple inverted primitives with some extrusions to match the shape of the windows. So if I hide those, you can see right through it. And this is important with when we have transparent windows, which we want for realism, is to have something behind, and potentially maybe after this I will be adding some curtains or something behind the glass, just so we don't see too much into the environment. But I would recommend adding something just so you do see inside and the windows are not just reflective. The flashing metal parts that I added, they are all essentially one-sided. They do have some small edge just so they catch some highlight. I didn't bevel those because it's so thin, it doesn't really have a point in beveling it. And as you can see, I've added quite a few edge loops here, and I've broken them up a bit just so they don't form very straight lines. You can see here it kinda goes in a wavy fashion, but not too repetitive. And next to them, like I was discussing, I've added those strips of polygons with just some breakup to create this sort of transition of mortar between the stonework and the metal, to kind of create the illusion that they were glued together. So that pretty much sums it for the environment modeling. We're going to be doing more stuff with the environment itself. We're going to be addressing the ground, we're going to be addressing some more stuff. But in terms of modeling, that is the final chapter. In next chapter we're going to be looking at texturing those stuff and improving the existing Substance Painter presets that we have. I hope you have learned something from this, and I will see you in the next chapter. Hello and welcome. This is going to be a look-at chapter in which we're going to focus mostly on texturing and shading of the environment. As you can see, what I've done here, I brought the model back into Substance Painter, I've created an increment save, and I've also assigned red materials to the parts that we are not going to be baking. And I did bake the rest, and I duplicated the existing materials, and so far what we can tell from looking at this is that some of it looks nice, such as the stonework and some of the textures, but overall it looks a bit chaotic, and we still have a lot of things to work on. Before we start diving into fixing the stonework, I would rather start instead by showing you the workflow I use for the windows, and specifically those types where you have not individually modeled sections, but rather one whole thing. And this workflow is to some degree gonna apply to the stonework as well. I like to do the next part in Substance Designer, and just so you know, you could always create a custom filter in Substance Designer that you could then use in Substance Painter. But I like to just work with textures instead. So what I've done, I've imported the ambient occlusion I've baked in Substance Painter just for those glass panels. And I also have, because the original texture for the stonework came from Substance Designer, I was able to isolate and export this grid, which is each individual brick that we have on the stonework texture that we are using. And if you're working with Megascans or textures.com, sometimes you might have this mask, sometimes you might have maybe ambient occlusion or curvature that you could then tweak with levels to create something like that, just so you have each individual brick and each individual glass panel isolated with a continuous dark line. To clean this up a bit, I'll add some levels. And I'll try to clump and I'll try to bring the gray areas to be completely white. And I don't mind if I slightly eat into the dark areas, because in the end it's actually going to help me. I might add some blur, either before or after. Maybe let's try to add it before. And nice. Now we have slightly thinner black lines, which is what we are looking for. Because looking at Substance Painter, we can see that some of the anti-aliasing doesn't work as well on those edges, and we might not want to see any of those lines coming from underneath the metal at all. So having this blur kinda allows us to get rid of that. The next thing we want to do is we want to drop a flood fill. And I'm gonna slightly tidy this up, and I'll plug this into flood fill. It doesn't recognize it, so I could either try and see if there is something else I could bring in, and by the way I would also need those nodes as well. So flood fill to gradient, and I will convert this to grayscale, so scale conversion, because it's a bitmap which is then being blurred and clumped. I'm just gonna convert it into grayscale and then plug it into this, and let's see what we get. So flood fill is just doing its magic in the background, and flood fill to gradient allows us to create a gradient which then we can randomize on each individual one of those sections of the glass. Now, if you remember looking at the reference, we can see that some of the individual sections of the glass, they seem to be pointing in a slightly different direction and to be angled or just pushed or pulled by the metal frame into slightly different directions. So you can see it's a bit faceted, but my suggestion was to not model it, simply because you never know what the result is going to be in lookdev. So instead of having something that you have baked into the model and then you need to adjust it and make it less or more prominent, you can just simply use textures, which is going to give you the same exact result, but it's much easier to adjust. So after we created those masks, let's jump back into Substance Painter and let's take a look at the windows. So first of all, we can see on this specific wall the smart material didn't work as well as expected, also because we need to adjust the placement of the different things. So I'll disable the things that are distracting us at the moment. And this looks not bad. And if you remember, we also have some more adjustments to do in the future, because you can see the arches would not have bricks that are continuing the overall bricks. They would probably go and follow the arch, and also the lines here are not entirely correct, but we're going to come back to it later. So looking specifically at the glass, I have the window randomization color that I created and the height that I created by using those Substance Designer textures. So I will just create a fill layer, and what I'll do, I will just add this into height, and you can see it's already creating some sort of interesting illusion where each facet is moving in different direction, but it looks as if they end just on the line where the metal parts begin. So we're gonna have to adjust that by shrinking the black lines further in Substance Designer. And we're gonna try and plug this into base color and see what we get. And this is at the moment not very PBR, so I will just create a fill layer. And let's say something like this for the glass, set to, let's say, 70% opacity. And now we can see there is some color variation coming through, but not too much. Let's say it has very little roughness, so 0.05. And the height, because at the moment the height that we have is a bit too strong, and it's mostly pushing out, because remember that the height that we have here is starting from 0 and it goes to 1. However, the default height here is 0, so it's only pushing out. So I'm going to offset this by minus 0.5, just so you can see now stuff is either slightly pushed in or slightly pushed out, but not just pushed out in one direction, which is going to be important when we use displacement and shading. And one more thing that we can notice is this thing is slightly faceted because of artifacts. So what we can do is we can just add some filter and blur, just to get it a bit more smooth, which fixed some of the artifacts, but we're still going to have to jump back and address some of it in Substance Designer, which we can achieve just by plugging the output of the existing color with the lines into the source input of the distance node and saving out the output, just because I would rather have no lines in the diffuse, and I could always add those using the ambient occlusion in Substance Painter. Having imported those resources back into Substance Painter, I can see that I still get just a tiny bit of artifacts, simply because each individual island has so much difference in between them. So I'm just gonna look into the height channel, and I could either reduce this to, let's say, 10 or maybe 20, and activate the blur again. And this gets rid of some of the artifacts, if not most of them. And potentially less, let's say. Or maybe we could just add a fill layer with height set to normal before the blur. And it could be, let's say, set to 90%. So we could crank this back up, and this would be 95. And now you can see we are getting this small variation between each individual facet, both in color and reflection and everything else. And we could also plug this into roughness if we wanted to. And it starts to look quite a lot like the reference. So the next step would be, if you remember, some of those things, they had some sort of grain to them. And again, like, we could get rid of all the artifacts by trying to reduce the detail by blurring it a bit more, but I think this is enough. And I actually kind of like the result of what some of them are giving me. So, for example, if I wanted to create now some Berlin with just a lot of repetition, something like this, add black mask and then add fill this into here, add levels, and then let's set this is 3, weapon 1. I could now create different patterns on each individual glass panel, and I could create some variation and some more difference in height between them and in different bump detail. And if it's too prominent, I could always create a fill, set the height channel to normal, set it to 99 or something, maybe 95. And now we have this subtle variation of some of the glass pieces being more smooth, some of them having those straight lines, and some of them having this sort of bump to them. Another thing I would recommend doing is, because looking at the reference, you could see that the glass itself has some overall waviness to it, which might not necessarily be readable looking at this. We could just create yet another layer, or we could just keep reusing the original one, but I would rather keep it separate. And in height channel we could add galvanic. And then remove the dirt and remove the micro distortion, and then maybe set it to 0.5 repetition, and maybe add some filter blur. Maybe set it to 1, and then the height of it, let's set it to 1 as well, maybe 5. Maybe split the difference, 3. I think still potentially a bit too strong, 2. So now we have this sort of large detail which comes from the overall waviness from the galvanic. And we also have the secondary medium detail which comes from the masks in Substance Designer that break it up to each individual section. And then we have this small glass bump that are driven by the masks that we've created just to add some variation in between the glass details. Now, this is just the base layer of the glass. We might want to also add opacity to here. So opacity, and also to add it in the shader if you're using an older version of Substance Painter. And even in here, what we could do is we could have some of those pieces of the glass to be less opaque, just by plugging this into here. And then, if you remember, we have this channel that kinda flattens the height just by being set on normal to 95. What we can do is we can also go to opacity, and in opacity set it to, let's say, 0.5, and let's set it to 90% opaque, or maybe 50%, 75. And now you can see we have some slight variation that's not too distracting, but also it's there. And this is why also we're gonna have to put something behind those glass panels so we could see some sort of exterior through the windows, just like we see here. And you can see from certain angles this already starts to look quite nice, and we didn't even get to any roughness or any other material on the glass. And speaking of which, let's group those, or just keep them as they are, but let's just name them big glass base, and this is glass small detail. And let's start by adding some sort of glue or paint or mortar that we see that is connecting all those panels to the metal and holding them in place, and also connecting the metal to the stonework. So let's just create, if we have a texture that just has like some generic noise on it, that's probably the best way to approach it. So let's dial it, I don't know, a dozen times. Let's give it some rotation just so it doesn't seem too uniform. Add black mask, add generator, and let's use dirt. Now, the biggest problem is with glass, and this is why I also cut each individual panel of glass into two parts, the inner and the outer, is when you look at ambient occlusion, this side looks black and white, which is predictable, but the inside often looks much darker because it's being occluded by the interior of the building. So we're gonna have to separate the way we treat the glass on the outer part and the inner part, and the way we're gonna do that is we're just gonna paint out everything, and we're gonna start adding in the exteriors. Sorry. And we're gonna set it to multiply just to get rid of the dirt generator. So Alt and click to isolate the mask, and let's drive this all the way down with just a teeny tiny bit of variation. And the challenge in this is we are getting some more detail in the corners, as you can see right here, which wouldn't necessarily be the case. So the way we could approach it, we could just minimize the dirt level to the bare minimum, and then add filter, something like blur slope with very low values, just to break it up a bit. So you can see it's not uniform and it protrudes differently from every section of the from underneath every section of the metal. So height, we're gonna need to set this to normal, and you see it starts to look a bit better, and also it helps us to get rid of the artifacts we were having before. Opacity, it should be fully opaque. We're gonna call this glue, and should be quite rough, should be slightly higher than an average glass section, and we could also plug the same thing into the roughness. Let's see how our roughness channel look, and add levels to clamp the roughness to make it a bit brighter, something like that. Add fill, I'm just gonna test how the roughness looks. Yeah, that's okay. And we've got this. I think maybe it's a bit too strong, so I'm just gonna clamp the gradual transitions which we don't really want, and add filter, sharpen, just for some slightly more breakup and sharpness there. And that starts to look as if there is some material gluing together the glass and the metal. And to address the roughness, we have the luxury, because those panels are so small, so we don't really necessarily have to have big shapes as prominently as in other windows. We can just create, let's say, something like this for the time being, and after we're gonna work on the rest of the windows, we can copy paste the same dust layer. So we don't need the metallic, we don't need the normal in here. The opacity is going to be set to 1. Add black mask, and in procedurals here we can search for leaks, and I think this we could combine two of those. Add fill, something like this. They are too big obviously, so we're gonna set it to 5 or so, and add fill 4, maybe 7, overlay. And what this gives us, it just gives us some sort of dust and grunge. The problem with this is it creates the same thing on the inside as well. Now, looking at the windows, I think we can all agree that the outside is going to be a bit more dusty and it's going to have rain leaks and splats all over it, whereas the inside is going to be less dirty because it's more accessible, especially on a window that you can actually properly access, and a window like this that doesn't open, the outside is going to be much more complicated to clean, and therefore the inside is going to have some sort of wipes and a slightly different detail, maybe cobwebs or something like this, but the outside is going to have much more dust and dirt built up on it. So the way to fix this is very simple. I'll just call this ext dust. I'll duplicate the same layer because we're going to be using the same material, and I'm going to call it int wipes, add black mask, and we could just add a procedural called wipes, and there's quite a few of them to choose from, and I usually gravitate towards this one. And then we're gonna have to scale it down to 9 or something like this, give it some nice rotation because it doesn't have a clear direction to it, opposed to the leaks, because if we gave rotation to those we could see that. And maybe even 12. And maybe a bit less balance, and then paint on both layers. And you could be more efficient and you could create somewhere in the beginning here, instead of creating paint every time, you could create a fill layer or a paint layer with a mask. So I'll just call this mask. Next, int add black mask. And using the UV island selection, I can then make sure that I indeed select only the exterior. And I can repeat the process for all of them, which I will, and create an anchor point, and then reference this mask every time I need to reference the paint. Like for example, in this case, instead of a glue, I can just create a fill and use the mask exterior interior to get rid of stuff I don't want, and also here in the exterior as well, add fill. And in here, because I want to be using the reverse of it, instead of setting it to multiply, I can set it to subtract. Looking back in Substance Designer, I can see that some of those lines, as thin as they can be, and I cannot clump them anymore without losing each individual glass spout. So what I can do, I can just get rid of the dark lines whilst retaining the overall detail. So I will just drop a distance node, and I will plug this thing into here, and the mask input is going to be the mask that we were using to generate those. So just the original grid goes into the first input, and the result of our combined efforts of creating something that has variation goes into the second, into the source input. And now this result has no dark lines. And if you compare between them, you can see how now the information is kind of blended in between the two, which should be helpful both for the bricks, because we are not going to be using a lot of information on the lines between the bricks where the mortar is anyway. So this is going to be what we're going to be using for the height, and potentially also the color. Looking back in Substance Designer, I can see that some of those lines, as thin as they can be, and I cannot clump them anymore without losing each individual glass part. So what I can do, I can just get rid of the dark lines whilst retaining the overall detail. So I will just drop a distance node, and I will plug this thing into here, and the mask input is going to be the mask that we were using to generate those. So just the original grid goes into the first input, and the result of our combined efforts of creating something that has variation goes into the second, into the source input. And now this result has no dark lines. And if you compare between them, you can see how now the information is kind of blended in between the two, which should be helpful both for the bricks, because we are not going to be using a lot of information on the lines between the bricks where the mortar is anyway. So this is going to be what we're going to be using for the height, and potentially also the color, which we can achieve just by plugging the output of the existing color with the lines into the source input of the distance node and saving out the output, just because I would rather have no lines in the diffuse, and I could always add those using the ambient occlusion in Substance Painter. Having imported those resources back into Substance Painter, I can see that I still get just a tiny bit of artifacts, simply because each individual island has so much difference in between them. So I'm just gonna look into the height channel, and I could either reduce this to, let's say, 10 or maybe 20, and activate the blur again. And this gets rid of some of the artifacts, if not most of them. And potentially less, let's say. Or maybe we could just add a fill layer with height set to normal before the blur. And it could be, let's say, set to 90%. So we could crank this back up, and this would be 95. And now you can see we are getting this small variation between each individual facet, both in color and reflection and everything else. And we could also plug this into roughness if we wanted to. And it starts to look quite a lot like the reference. So the next step would be, if you remember, some of those things, they had some sort of grain to them. And again, like, we could get rid of all the artifacts by trying to reduce the detail by blurring it a bit more, but I think this is enough. And I actually kind of like the result of what some of them are giving me. So, for example, if I wanted to create now some Berlin with just a lot of repetition, something like this, add black mask, and then add fill this into here, add levels, and then let's set this is 3, weapon 1. I could now create different patterns on each individual glass panel, and I could create some variation and some more difference in height between them and in different bump detail. And if it's too prominent, I could always create a fill, set the height channel to normal, set it to 99 or something, maybe 95. And now we have this subtle variation of some of the glass pieces being more smooth, some of them having those straight lines, and some of them having this sort of bump to them. Another thing I would recommend doing is, because looking at the reference, you could see that the glass itself has some overall waviness to it, which might not necessarily be readable looking at this. We could just create yet another layer, or we could just keep reusing the original one, but I would rather keep it separate. And in height channel we could add galvanic. And then remove the dirt and remove the micro distortion, and then maybe set it to 0.5 repetition, and maybe add some filter blur. Maybe set it to 1, and then the height of it, let's set it to 1 as well. Maybe 5. Maybe split the difference. 3. I think still potentially a bit too strong. 2. So now we have this sort of large detail which comes from the overall waviness from the galvanic. And we also have the secondary medium detail which comes from the masks in Substance Designer that break it up to each individual section. And then we have the small glass bump that are driven by the masks that we've created just to add some variation in between the glass details. Now, this is just the base layer of the glass. We might want to also add opacity to here. So opacity, and also to add it in the shader if you're using an older version of Substance Painter. And even in here, what we could do is we could have some of those pieces of the glass to be less opaque, just by plugging this into here. And then, if you remember, we have this channel that kinda flattens the height just by being set on normal to 95. What we can do is we can also go to opacity, and in opacity set it to, let's say, 0.5, and let's set it to 90% opaque, or maybe 50%, 75. And now you can see we have some slight variation that's not too distracting, but also it's there. And this is why also we're gonna have to put something behind those glass panels so we could see some sort of exterior through the windows, just like we see here. And you can see from certain angles this already starts to look quite nice, and we didn't even get to any roughness or any other material on the glass. And speaking of which, let's group those, or just keep them as they are, but let's just name them big glass base, and this is glass small detail. And let's start by adding some sort of glue or paint or mortar that we see that is connecting all those panels to the metal and holding them in place, and also connecting the metal to the stonework. So let's just create, if we have a texture that just has like some generic noise on it, that's probably the best way to approach it. So let's dial it, I don't know, 1,000 times. Let's give it some rotation just so it doesn't seem too uniform. Add black mask, add generator, and let's use dirt. Now, the biggest problem is with glass, and this is why I also cut each individual panel of glass into two parts, the inner and the outer, is when you look at ambient occlusion, this side looks black and white, which is predictable, but the inside often looks much darker because it's being occluded by the interior of the building. So we're gonna have to separate the way we treat the glass on the outer part and the inner part, and the way we're gonna do that is we're just gonna paint out everything and we're gonna start adding in the exteriors. Sorry. And we're gonna set it to multiply just to get rid of the dirt generator. So Alt and click to isolate the mask, and let's drive this all the way down with just a teeny tiny bit of variation. And the challenge in this is we are getting some more detail in the corners, as you can see right here, which wouldn't necessarily be the case. So the way we could approach it, we could just minimize the dirt level to the bare minimum, and then add filter, something like a blur slope with very low values, just to break it up a bit. So you can see it's not uniform and it protrudes differently from every section of the from underneath every section of the metal. So height, we're gonna need to set this to normal, and you see it starts to look a bit better, and also it helps us to get rid of the artifacts we were having before. Opacity, it should be fully opaque. We're gonna call this glue, and should be quite rough, should be slightly higher than an average glass section, and we could also plug the same thing into the roughness. Let's see how our roughness channel look, and add levels to clamp the roughness to make it a bit brighter, something like that. Add fill, I'm just gonna test how the roughness looks. Yeah, that's okay. And we've got this. I think maybe it's a bit too strong, so I'm just gonna clamp the gradual transitions which we don't really want, and add filter, sharpen, just for some slightly more breakup and sharpness there. And that starts to look as if there is some material gluing together the glass and the metal. And now to create some roughness on the glass, and to address the roughness, we have the luxury, because those panels are so small, so we don't really necessarily have to have big shapes as prominently as in other windows. We can just create, let's say, something like this for the time being, and after we're gonna work on the rest of the windows, we can copy paste the same dust layer. So we don't need the metallic, we don't need the normal in here. The opacity is gonna be set to 1. Add black mask, and in procedurals here we can search for leaks. And I think this, we could combine two of those, add fill, something like this. They are too big, obviously, so I'm gonna set it to 5 or so, and add fill 4, maybe 7. Overlay. And what this gives us, it just gives us some sort of dust and grunge. The problem with this is it creates the same thing on the inside as well. Now, looking at the windows, I think we can all agree that the outside is going to be a bit more dusty, and it's going to have rain leaks and splats all over it, whereas the inside is going to be less dirty because it's more accessible, especially on a window that you can actually properly access, and a window like this that doesn't open, the outside is going to be much more complicated to clean. And Therefore, the inside is going to have some sort of wipes and a slightly different detail, maybe cobwebs or something like this, but the outside is going to have much more dust and dirt built up on it. So the way to fix this is very simple. I'll just call this ext dust. I'll duplicate the same layer because we're going to be using the same material, and I'm going to call it int wipes. Add black mask, and we could just add a procedural called wipes. And there's quite a few of them to choose from, and I usually gravitate towards this one. And then we're gonna have to scale it down to 9 or something like this. Give it some nice rotation because it doesn't have a clear direction to it, opposed to the leaks, because if we gave rotation to those we could see that. And maybe even 12. And maybe a bit less balance, and then paint on both layers. And you could be more efficient, and you could create somewhere in the beginning here, instead of creating paint every time, you could create a fill layer or a paint layer with a mask. So I'll just call this mask. Next, int add black mask. And using the UV island selection, I can then make sure that I indeed select only the exterior. And I can repeat the process for all of them, which I will, and create an anchor point, and then reference this mask every time I need to reference the paint. Like for example, in this case, instead of a glue, I can just create a fill and use the mask exterior interior to get rid of stuff I don't want, and also here in the exterior as well, add fill. And in here, because I want to be using the reverse of it, instead of setting it to multiply, I can set it to subtract. Having done off screen the process of creating a mask for the interior and exterior for the rest of the windows, and looking at this, I think the result is starting to shape, but there is still a few tiny things we could do. So I think the exterior detail is still a tiny bit too big. So instead of tiling this 5, we're gonna tile it 9 times. And instead of tiling this, we're gonna tile it 11 times, potentially even more. And one more thing I would like to add to the exterior generator is also some dirt, because in this case the build-up in the corner does make sense. I think this is a bit too high by default, so I'll just reduce it to something like this. And now we will just set this to add, so it adds it everywhere else, but because if you remember, still it adds it on the inside as well. We don't want that. We can add it under the multiply, which is remove the interior essentially. And again, in the interior you would have a different dirt. So if you're sorry, not your generator, and in here it would be much less prominent, but it would still exist. And again, this goes as add under this. And now we have some wipes. Potentially we want more wipes, something like that. And maybe to break up the wipes a bit, I'll add another layer with wipes, like this, and maybe multiply before the dirt, because I still want the dirt. something like this. And one last thing, I think we are starting to lose some of the bump detail that we've had. And let's see what channel is causing it. So I think maybe this is a bit too strong. And then going back to the small detail, maybe it should be just a bit stronger. And I was also thinking of it, I might want it also in the roughness channel as well. Because differences in the surface, and we need to make sure we have the same 64 scale on both of them, just so it matches the roughness. Because the differences in the surface would also affect the roughness. And sorry, I want it essentially to be opposite of what it is at the moment. Because where it's deeper, I want it to be more rough, something like this. Because then the dust would accumulate in there. And maybe something like this, just so it's ever so slightly present in there. To apply the same sort of preset we have in here for the windows to the other windows, we're just going to copy and paste all the layers, but then treat each of them slightly differently, because the setup is somewhat different. So we're going to start by glass base, and naturally here we don't have the base color and the height imported from elsewhere, so we're just going to remove those. And by switching to base color, I will just make sure that this one is off. And I will create a generator which is called UV Random Island, UV Random Color, sorry, and instead of using a random gradient, I'll create custom gradient based by color, and I can then use the Windows random color as a custom gradient, and at the moment it's a bit too strong, so I will just put it under the fill, which, if you remember, we have a flatten and a fill that gets rid of the color a bit. And now we have a somewhat similar colors, because those are driven by the same gradient and they are treated in the same way. And instead of height, I will just use Berlin noise, but this Berlin noise which I think at the moment is being overridden. Let's see. And we have the Berlin noise. Because this Berlin noise is so large, at the moment you can see each of it is and the UV random color needs to only affect the color and not anything else. So this is the Berlin noise that we have at the moment. And if we set it on very, very low opacity, meaning that whatever we are using to override it, we set it to actually, flatten normal to 99. Right. Now you can see that whenever the reflection moves in between each sections, it kind of jumps a bit because each of those are facing slightly different direction. Maybe 95, 96, oh 7. Yep, that's a bit better. So you can see now we get this sort of wobbly reflection we get elsewhere, as we should. but now we don't need to generate it in Substance Designer. And again, that's the benefit of using those smaller sections, but it's also think of the amount of polygons you would spend here, and I find it a bit more efficient to use the other ones just in the texture. But both workflows, they are valid. And I will just slightly blur it like it used to be before. Glass small detail. So here, instead of using a mask that we were using before, which is the Windows random height, I can just create a generator, and I could have it under the levels. And on those big windows, normally I don't think you would have this sort of a small bump. So I think it's actually unnecessary on this one. And we are getting just a tiny bit of artifacts, and they're actually coming from the blur. So I'm gonna get rid of that as well. And now we have the height big, which is the galvanic. We could keep it, so maybe we could flatten it just a tiny bit more, and then this could be maybe 1%. Because we don't want it to be too wobbly, we want it to be just believable enough. So I think this is a good middle ground. Glue. So this is going to be a bit more interesting, because here instead of glue we're going to have paint that goes on top of the glass. So let's see what we have here. So we have the dirt, and dirt is not going to give us the uniform result that we want, and we also need to mask it out. So what I would suggest we do, instead of dirt, we use a different generator, the one that's called UV borders, simply because each of those are cut into 2 UV islands, and by using this border it's just going to give us more or less the same result across the board, because again, as you can see, the interior and the exterior part are 2 different sections. So this gives us something that's a bit more appropriate. For this case. And then some blur slope and sharpen, and this is just going to be temporary because I would have to match the material of the wood afterwards. But let's say, for the sake of argument, for the time being, this is what I have, and potentially I want just a bit more, and maybe slightly less on the blur slope. Something like this, and we don't want the sharpen, and the height of it would be probably a bit lower. So now we got something like this, and you see it nicely breaks up the shape of those straight lines that we have, so it starts to look a bit less CG. Exterior dust, again, we would have to go to the original layer and we would have to adjust it. For the time being, I will disable it, and you can see it sort of works here and it matches the reference. A slightly better way to approach it would be just to use a texture of the windows. I was lucky enough to find some boarded windows which had this sort of fake wooden board or plastic and the frame, so I could take photos of those and it would give me the same exact detail more or less you would get on the glass with all the splatters and everything else, whilst still not having to deal with the challenge of masking out the interior. And having photographed a bunch of those windows on that abandoned building, I've created this sort of sheet that I can then use to create something. So by importing this texture into here, I could potentially keep the dirt, And the way I would approach it, I would just bring it into here and use it as a planar projection, which then I would scale and try to just match a couple of those windows. One. And then I would offset it horizontally and vertically depending on my needs. So something like this maybe. And again, it might be a bit tricky with the proportions of the windows, but it's gonna give you a slightly nicer result, I find, at least where you manage to match it well. So for example, here you can see it's not doing what it's intended, so I would try and offset it down maybe. Something like this. And then I will just isolate and go window by window and adjust it. So you would adjust it on those two windows, then those two windows, then the bottom ones. And it would be quite time consuming, but I find that the final result would be a bit better. And again, looking at this, I think that, yeah, this is looking much better because then it's encompassing the right windows. So something like this, and then on this side as well, it works quite well. So I would just have add paint. I would just have a bunch of those. And I would work essentially one group of windows at a time to try and match it. And then this set to multiply. And one thing we need to do is we also need to invert the original and make it slightly less prominent. So you can see, again, depending on how heavy-handed you want your detail to be, this might be the right approach, this might be not. And again, if you have not a lot of time and resources and you don't have this texture, it might be a bit more challenging. But once you have this workflow done, and if you have the resources, I think this is going to look much more believable, especially with some sort of variation from the top coming to the bottom, than just having a terrible procedural substance paint or mask repeating all over the place.